Hello. So I wrote a book a long time ago, maybe not a long time ago, maybe like a year or two ago, maybe coming up on 3, called Meditations. And it's just a bunch of thoughts that I've considered over the years of reading and wrote about. And I want to share one of the ideas from this book. And it's the chapter is called What Can Dissolve the Individual? And I got the idea from Carl Jung primarily, because Jung has this essay where he talks about things that negate someone's sense of individuality. But what I didn't like about Jung's conversation on the topic was that Jung made it really esoteric because, for example, in Jung's notion of the individual, it is someone who can blend together or unify the unconscious dream states or the dream self with the conscious self. And you do that through interpreting dreams. But I thought that was a bit esoteric. That's just one of the things. There's other things that he includes. And so I kind of reflected on it myself, and I sampled from different writers and different ideas and thought about what it actually means for the individual to be dissolved. So the first thing I had to do when I was thinking about this topic was, what does it mean to be an individual? And the best conception I could come up with, because there's a lot of different notions in philosophy about what an individual is, the best conception I could come up with is like the freedom to pursue what you want on a day-to-day basis, and that want has to come from a position of self-reflection. So if you wake up and you want to, let's say, play video games, but your lifelong goal is to be someone who makes hundreds of millions of dollars or whatever, then that's not a want that's coming from a position of your self-reflection. That's a want that's coming from like your spontaneous desires, right? So you have to have, on the one hand, this ability to do what you want, but then also your want has to come from a position of self-reflection, not like this spontaneous, unconscious kind of urges or sensations that you might kind of compare to like an urge for hunger or an urge for a snack. You know, when you see like a really delicious pastry when you're walking by a bakery, you kind of have a sudden urge to eat that pastry. That wouldn't be from a position of self-reflection. It's kind of like spontaneous and unconscious. And now with that notion of self or like individual, it was pretty easy to come up with some things that could negate or dissolve your individuality. And the first one that I wrote was the internalization of societal standards. So maybe the best trope to think about this is that there's this idea in the Western world about this conveyor belt of going from middle school or like primary school to middle school to high school and then all the way up into college or university, and then you get a job, and then you get that job, you buy a house, and then you buy your house, you retire. That might be like a standard for a way of life that if you internalize is kind of like an internalization of societal standards. Now, it isn't to say that you couldn't self-reflect and want a life like that, but if it's kind of a spontaneous or automatic thing that you do, and you haven't really thought about it critically whether you want it or not, then I would say it's like an internalization of societal standards. You could say the same thing about luxury brands, how they're viewed as favorable, and wearing a luxury brand is a good thing. That could be another internalization of a societal standard. If you adopt the primary religion of your society, that could be another internalization of societal standards. These kind of things that are spread or have proliferated throughout society, if you internalize them and make them who you are as a person, without doing it from that position of self-reflection, is then you in turn negating your sense of individuality. Another one might be instincts. Another category in which that can dissolve the individual is like instincts or human nature. So I think most people agree that some kind of human nature exists. And if some kind of human nature exists, then what are the characteristics that are present? And I think maybe the most obvious low-hanging one that we could discuss is sex. So people who make their personas based off of sex, how many sexual partners they have, how easy it is for them to get women or men, right? Kind of turning their whole entire personality into sex, just straight up sex, can be another example of someone who's internalized something that didn't come from a position of self-reflection, and as a result has dissolved their sense of individuality, right? Because that's not who they really are, that's just their human nature speaking. Another one on the human nature side might be just short-term thinking or like hedonism. Some people might want to, again, genuinely have a hedonistic life, and it comes from a position of self-reflection. But in my experience, a lot of people, from what I've seen, struggle to fight off their hedonistic urges and pursue their long-term goals. Usually people will fall to the short-term pleasure and get rid of the long-term goals. But the long-term goals are like their true north, or like their self-reflected self. I think the term that some psychologists use is self-actualization. But that's another example of human nature kind of dissolving the individual, is when you're too hedonistic from a position of non-self-reflection. Now, there are two here that are kind of contentious, and you could argue back and forth about these two because they're more philosophically inclined. They have more to do with metaphysics than, let's say, like the empirical conditions of your perceptions. And it's the denial of the will. So I think if you're someone who doesn't actually believe in free will and you kind of just go about your day haphazardly, not thinking too much about it, then I would probably, as far as I can imagine a person like that, it would be someone who's governed by spontaneous urges all the time. So if you had the urge to, I don't know, eat vegetables today, then you'll do it. But if you have the urge to eat donuts tomorrow, then you'll do it. And you would kind of not convince yourself to do otherwise because that's just the deterministic nature of things. Again, I'm not someone who is a hard determinist when it comes to my own subjective experiences. So when I try to imagine someone like that, I imagine somebody who doesn't have a really well-defined sense of individuality. And then the next one is the denial of the subject-object distinction. This one kind of, I think the reason why you lose a sense of individuality here is because everything includes the self. And so it's such a wide breadth of a definition that it almost doesn't define individuality whatsoever. There's no distinction between an individual and a plural if you only have a subject worldview or if you only have an object worldview. Because if in the world of only there being subject, then like your books are you, the people in front of you are you, everything is you. And so it's either everything is a non-individual or an individual, and in which case it's so exhaustive it doesn't make sense to even talk about what can dissolve the individual. Or everything is an object, in which case there is no self, it's all just illusion. And so again, it doesn't make sense to talk about what can dissolve the sense of an individual. So I think in that sense, you kind of do dissolve the individual by having such a wide breadth of a definition. Again, that's more of an issue of metaphysics, depending on which axioms you want to take. And these next two are a little bit less philosophical. One is obligations. Obligations can add this like psychological pressure for you to commit certain actions or do certain things that you wouldn't otherwise do. And sometimes you want those obligations, but sometimes the obligations are like temporary things that you have to do in order to get to the higher version of your living or like yourself. And so obligations can do that, right? Sometimes they cut into your free time and you don't want to be doing them, but you have to do them. And so now you have in some sense, you're spending less time living out your notion of individuality, and therefore it can dissolve yourself slightly. In addition to that, you have a neurosis or like mental health problems. So the best thing I can think of is like the cognitive behavioral therapy outlook about appraisals. Like it's Beckett, who's very famous for this, where he says, you can look at a stimulus or you can look at stimuli and it can be neutral, it can be negative, or it can be positive, right? It can be one of these three things. And people who tend to have an overly pessimistic mental health condition, whether it's like an anxious attachment or depression or some sort, tend to look at stimuli that is neutral and interpret it negatively, which is something that could be entirely at clash with your higher notion of living, right? Maybe you want to have a happy world, but you're over here on like automatic mode interpreting everything as negative. And then there are some people who might be like manic, and they look at a stimuli and they interpret it as overly positive, which is, again, maybe they have a different worldview towards this overly positive interpretation, and it can be negating their sense of individual. It's basically like the way Jung and Freud characterize neurosis, it's almost like its own module inside the mind. And there's like a greater context of the mind, and this small little neurotic module has way more influence than the overall picture or within the overall picture. And it's overriding other faculties of the mind. That's kind of how they characterize it. And I think that's a useful characterization because then it lets you separate it from who you are as a person and pursue your actual self and view this thing that is like dissolving yourself, right? This like neurosis that's trying to negate yourself and you kind of almost have like a combat with it, right? Makes you second guess everything. So those are some of the things that I think can dissolve the notion of a self or an individual. I know Carl Jung talks a lot about the individual and what can dissolve it. This is where I got the kind of idea to write this essay, but his is a bit more esoteric. If you have any notions that also would dissolve the individual, I'd be interested in hearing them, because I still think about this subject, even though I've written about it. I haven't like talked it away. It's just, I come back to it every once in a while. I think, is this person like acting from like a position of individuality, or are they acting from some other thing that would negate their individuality? I think it's always an interesting thought experiment to consider. Let me know what you think down below. And with that being said, bye-bye for now.